Good morning, evening and afternoon, my dear Simeon. We are in reset day for NA, we are approaching reset day for EU, and today we have our almost weekly update for the raid situation. Last time we checked was, I believe, 9 days ago. It was basically right before yet another round of hotfixes of nerfs and buffs hit the live servers. So it's gonna be quite interesting as we check our update of how things have been going on in the raid, if some of these changes with the hotfix have, moved things around a bit. If, of course, you don't remember what am I talking about with this round of hotfixes, the round of hotfixes of the 6th of February changed by buffing the damage of Blood Death Knight. It also buffed the damage of Frost Death Knight, and more importantly, it gave more way to the possibility of playing the two-handed build for Frost Death Knight. It also buffed Guardian Druid quite a bit. It also nerfed, this was the main change for healers, it nerfed Restoration Druid and Preservation Evoker. It buffed all Hunters' damage by 5%. It buffed the throughput of Mistweaver Monk. It buffed the damage of Protection Paladin, it buffed the healing of Holy Priest, it buffed the healing even more so of Restoration Shaman, and then some minor tiny changes to Warlock. These were the modifications that landed on February the 6th. So now we are 1 week after the hotfix. Of course, it is still somewhat early to see basically all of the changes which might happen because of this hotfix, but maybe we can already start seeing a glimpse of these changes in our overall look at the meters and the rankings of the raid so far. First of all, I wanted to show you the divide between how things are in heroic raiding and how things are in mythic raiding, because at the end of the day, actually, as you might very well know already, there are quite a few more players getting into or playing exclusively heroic rather than mythic, even though mythic of course is the more competitive type of difficulty, even though the meta is shaped around what's strong in mythic. This, for example, is how the damage has been in heroic, something you see discussed very often, something which also you see pointed out by many players as being somewhat irrelevant, because nowadays bosses in heroic are just getting zerged down, they're getting burst down, which means specs with very powerful burst windows that can benefit the most from Bloodlust in a short window, since the bosses now live for like 2 minutes, are going to show up much better on the meters. So this is what we have in heroic of Vault of the Incarnates so far, comparing it to how things are in mythic. And you can see, of course, some of these are quite interesting, because you see Unholy Death Knight and Assassination Rogue, as well as Frost Mage and Arcane Mage in the top 5 in heroic. Even Affliction Warlock is 6th in heroic. As soon as you move over to mythic, though, they suddenly all shift to the bottom half of the meter. Frost Mage, Arcane Mage, Unholy Death Knight, Affliction Warlock, they basically all disappear, and we make way for a whole bunch of new specs in mythic. These are the same specs we mentioned last time we checked this. The rise of the buffed specs, either from the 9th of January's hotfix or from the 10.0.5 patch. Shadow Priest, Arms Warrior, Devastation Evoker, as well as Red Paladin, as well as Feral Druid were amongst some of the buffed specs, and now we see that the top 3 overall performers in the 90 percentile of performance are 3 of the buffed specs recently. Now, worth pointing out, for example, that despite the buff to the two-handed version of Death Knight at the moment, in the raid at the very least, the Obliterate version, the two-handed version of Death Knight, is still not really getting off. Is still mostly just the breath version, the dual-wielding version of Frost Death Knight, which is the only played, basically, spec version in the raid so far. Another interesting thing is that now with the 5% damage buff to Hunters, The only one of the hunters we see rising a little bit more is marksmanship, especially compared to last week. Marksmanship gains some 6 to 7 ranks compared to last week after getting buffed by 5% in damage. There was, as mentioned, a very tiny buff to warlocks. I'm not sure if that buff is actually the reason why demonology now has gained similarly some 5 to 6 ranks compared to 8 days ago. Now it just managed to go past the middle of the pack as a ranged spec. It feels like it's still quite bad. You see demonology, you see demo in this list and you think it's terrible, right? It's just completely unexciting. But when you start looking at it, you realize it's the third best range spec. I know, it's quite depressing, but it's currently still complete melee domination in the top half, because in the top half, besides Shadow Priest and besides Devastation Evoker, the two newly very highly buffed specs, the rest is just melee, because you have Arms, Sub, Outlaw, Fury, Havoc, Ret, Frost Decay, Feral Druid, and Windwalker Monk, 9 melee specs in the top 11 of the specs in the raid, as far as performance is concerned. So even just being some average middle of the pack spec like demo makes you the third best range DPS spec at the moment. We can also draw a few things from the popularity from the last time we looked at it. Now there has been a swap between, of course, looking at the growth of marksmanship in damage, there has been a swap between Beast Mastery, which used to be the second most popular, a swap with marksmanship. Now it's marksmanship, the second most popular, as a testament as how easy it is for some of these pure DPS classes to simply reroll, to simply respec to a different spec depending on which one of them is doing the best. Same goes between the difference of Frost Mage and Arcane Mage. Frost Mage used to be in the top 10, now it's Arcane that's in the top 10. There was also surprisingly the growth of Arms, given how much better it was doing in the raid last time. Now, however, Fury has been able to climb a few more ranks compared to Arms Warrior, and surprisingly, this is still quite interesting of a phenomenon, despite Subtlety Rogue still being so well performing, still being so often towards the top of the performers in the raid, it still remains one of the least played specs in the game. It's honestly quite jarring to see Subtlety next to Elemental, Subtlety next to Affliction, next to Survival Hunter, despite of course being like the first or the second or third better performing spec for the majority of this raid, as opposed on the complete opposite, as opposed to Outlaw being constantly in the top 5 or so of most popular spec in the raid. Also interesting that despite the growth in damage, despite the growth in performance after getting buffed by quite a bit, Devastation Evoker and Shadow Priest have not really been growing nearly as fast, right? They're still more or less towards the middle. This also might be, just like we mentioned with Hunter, because it's not nearly as easy for them to reroll. It's much simpler, for example, to see Marksmanship or Fire Mage or Destruction Warlock or Outlaw Rogue suddenly spike at the top because you have 3 DPS specs in the class. So every player in that class can simply reroll to the strongest spec, depending on who gets buffed or who doesn't. But for specs, for hybrid specs, for specs that only have 1 DPS option in their class, it's not nearly as easy to get a sudden huge influx of players out of nowhere, right? The only way Devastation and Shadow Priest, even if now they are super strong, the only way they would be growing significantly is if they had Preservation Evokers rerolling to Devastation or Holy Priests rerolling to Shadow Priest. That's basically the only way you would have gotten so many more players for those two classes. We can, however, at the very least, give some props to some of these specs that are not looking too good in the overall damage meters by looking, for example, at the damage done to bosses. So, no AoE, no cleaving, just the focusing on a particular target, just the focusing on the boss damage, and you see, for example, Unholy Death Knight, Beast Mastery Hunter, Affliction Warlock, Assassination Rogue, and Survival Hunter making up the top 5. Now, these 5 specs are all towards the bottom half of the rankings. Most of them actually are towards the bottom like 5 of the specs, like Affliction and like Beast Mastery and Survival. So their damage, as long as it's just a single target, pure funneling of one target damage, is very, very good. It's still quite competitive. It has its uses in a raid encounter. It's just that when it comes to AoE, when it comes to 2-target cleave, they start lacking more compared to other specs. This is to say, for example, that not all specs which are, fallen at the bottom are considered bad. They are considered, at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to being needed and being wanted in a raid, as it is definitely not the case. We see specs like Arcane Mage, like Balance Druid, like Enhancement Shaman, which are definitely not, not weak specs in the raid. So the overall meters are bound to give you sometimes some misleading type of results. That's why most of the time, many times, players will warn you from trusting too much lists and rankings that pick everything up and bundle it up in an overall type of meter, because it can just ignore some more important parts, some important features of a raid, which you would have to look at more specifically. And that's why sometimes it can be misleading to trust this too much. Now, as far as our tier lists are concerned, this is where we might have seen something different, for example, for the healers. We haven't touched on the healers, but Mistweaver Monk and Resto Shaman have both been buffed in last week's hotfix. So, has something happened? Did we see something extra for those 2 specs in the raid? The answer, at the very least, for this moment is no. Mistweaver and Resto Shaman are still more or less towards the bottom of the rankings, as well as the 2 nerfed specs, Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker, are still towards the top. So, at the very least, for the time being, we are not seeing too many changes. We are seeing the first change when it comes to the melee DPS, because last time we saw a whole grand total of 6 different melee specs at the top in the S tier of raid performance. Now we only see 2 of the specs that were there before: Arms Warrior, the newly buffed Arms Warrior, and Havoc Demon Hunter. The other specs which previously were in the S tier get demoted into the A tier. So Enhancement, Windwalker, Fury, and Subtlety, with also Outlaw, which was already there last week. No change, of course, without any surprises here, to Survival, still being at the very, very bottom of the performance of melee DPS. Lastly, we have the ranged DPS. I was quite happy last week because finally we had what I thought was going or could have happened, right before we started to see the rise of the 2 buffed specs, Devastation and Shadow Priest. I was pointing out that, there were voices in the corridors, whispers about the growth in power of these 2 specs. Now we have seen them grow all the way towards the top of the performance. So this week we have it very nicely visualized. We have Devastation and Shadow Priest making up the S tier in performance of the ranged DPS. We have a demotion of Balance Druid back to the A tier with the lone Beast Mastery Hunter, which now stays there on its own. Interesting, we just checked the overall damage meters and Beast Mastery Hunter was towards the bottom half. It was outperformed by Marksmanship Hunter, yet in here it is still showing up as an A tier spec. When it comes to damage, we have also seen the damage done to bosses, the priority damage, the single target damage, and Beast Mastery Hunter is amongst the top 3 of performers when it comes to doing great single target damage. Perhaps the more interesting of the changes was the growth of Affliction Warlock, which goes from C tier to A tier. Unfortunately, talking about growing, what and who is not growing is Elemental, which is still chilling at the bottom, dead last, something we have pointed out as we went through several hotfixes and patches and changes to specs. One of, if not the only spec that was not changed, and by changed I mean buffed, was Elemental, which has still been left alone after weeks and weeks and weeks of this expansion, yet it's not that their performance justifies leaving them alone. It looks like Elemental is just another one of the specs which needs a bit of help to increase their performance, to fix some of their problems, because definitely they're not having too great of a time right now, either in PvP, PvE, Raid or Mythic Plus. It seems like they need some help. We will see after we get a few more days, a few more resets into this patch with all of these changes that we mentioned to the specs. We also have eventually 10.0.7, which will bring more changes to more specs. So we are bound to see some more shakeups in the meta. But for now, this is our updated situation when it comes to the raid. The raid performance, the raid popularity of specs, as well as the rankings of all of the different specs in their respective roles. For today, our recap when it comes to the raid is done. So as we are leaving each other on the eve of this weekly reset, we are starting our goodbyes by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of this channel. As usual, as you know by now, you can still support without having to spend a single dime. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are going to be good ways to show your support for free, just like it is following me over on Twitter, as well as following me over at my stream on Twitch. That is also going to be a good help eventually, also because one day it will go live, so that's going to be the best way for you to get notified. With all of these social blubberings out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I thought there wasn't that much to say for this weekly reset of the raid. How did the video get to be this long? I don't understand.